All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. If this is your first time watching, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer any questions you guys have about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. I host this show live Monday to Friday here at 2 p.m. Eastern. We do this live for a reason. If you've got follow-up questions or clarifying questions or just want to be a part of the conversation, that's what I'm here for. You can go ahead and throw your comments or questions into YouTube chat or in the Office Hours channel in Slack. We've got typically some awesome follow-up conversation going on day to day here. Sometimes maybe a little bit of conversation. I see there's some back and forth in the Office Hours channel here this morning on some of these questions. Highly recommend getting joined up in Slack. The link to join our Slack community is in the description of all past Office Hours videos. So once this video is up, it'll have that link, but any of the past Office Hours videos, the one from yesterday, the one from the day before that, they all have that link. So definitely recommend getting joined up in our Slack community here. Let's see, once a week, I've been using this time slot here for what we've been calling a strategy session, where we typically have some other members of the SaberSim team come on. We talk about a specific sport or contest type or topic in the DFS space, really whatever we feel is relevant for you guys or whatever we've been getting a lot of questions on lately. So we've been hitting baseball really hard with it being that time of year. I think all of the past 5 or 6 strategy sessions now have been pretty baseball focused. They are all up in a playlist on our YouTube channel if you want to check them out. I'm pretty excited for what we are going to be doing this week. It's going to be a little bit different. I think we're going to end up doing this one instead of doing a live show here. We're going to put together a video for you guys. And what we're going to do is I'm actually going to be walking through and building my build of lineups that I'm going to use in the MLB slate tonight, the actual lineups that I'm going to play, using all of the strategies that we've been talking about here in strategy sessions for the last few weeks, with Andy on to kind of help guide the conversation, ask some questions here or there, whatever really makes sense. So pretty excited about that. I think it's going to be a pretty interesting combination of talking about all these different elements that have come up recently, doing our research builds, getting familiar with the slate, adjusting projections and exposures where it makes sense, and ownership projections, running our build, and then dialing in some of these exposures. And I'm actually going to be talking about the real lineups, the real way I'm going to approach a slate tonight. So I know sometimes we talk a little bit about slate-specific strategy here or there. We talk about reviewing past slates and things like that, but I think it'll be pretty cool to talk about how we're going to actually apply some of the things we've learned in a lot of these strategy sessions recently for a live real slate. So should be a lot of fun. That video is going to come out tomorrow. So again, obviously can't go ahead and just build my lineups on stream and then send them out into the world tonight. So we're going to record the video tonight. I'll be recording it before the actual lock, so the actual lineups that I'm going to use. But then, of course, the video will come out tomorrow. So it should be a good reference point of how I'm actually going through and attacking a real slate. I get questions like that here all the time. What's your approach for the slate tonight? How are you tackling tonight's slate, right? This is going to be kind of trying to experiment with that, right? Here's a live slate, and I'm actually going to be building lineups live. So really excited for that. I think that's going to be a lot of fun, and look forward to that video probably coming out tomorrow for that. So without much more housekeeping here, I think we're probably ready to just dive in. A bit of a quiet day on the questions here overall. I see I've got at least a couple questions to dive into. So I will tackle these. I'll spend a little bit of extra time on some of these questions here today since we've got it. But great day to ask questions. If you've got something you've been waiting to ask or waiting for a good time where there's not such a busy day of office hours here, good day to ask it. As always, again, YouTube chat, office hours channel, and Slack, whatever is easier for you guys. And we will just get rocking and rolling here. Let me go ahead and pull up the app. Cool. Okay. So we've got our app pulled up here, and let me go ahead and dive into the first question here. This was from Devin here in Slack. And he said, what are some things we can do to dial in do in the dial-in process to make our lineups different from the field? In the past, you mentioned removing all 2 and 3 stacks of the chalkiest team. Is there anything else like that we could do? Yeah, so this is a good point. I actually have been kind of chewing on this idea of making this into maybe a strategy session here in the future, still kind of figuring out exactly how this would work. But what Devin's referring to here is this idea that I think I originally ended up talking about with Max here about A way that you can handle chalk and deal with chalk, especially on the hitting side, from a game theory standpoint, from looking at ceiling outcomes and what's likely to happen. And the fundamental idea here was, if you have chalk that you're expecting the field to gravitate towards heavily, and your research is leading you to thinking that you want to play that team, which definitely often happens. I think a team like that for tonight is Vegas believes the best hitting spot on the entire slate is for the White Sox, and so does SaberSim. SaberSim is actually over on the White Sox compared to Vegas, so there's a bit of an agreement there. I think even with an ownership fade slider a little bit higher, you're likely to get some White Sox bats because there's an agreement there that that's the best hitting spot on the night. So let me run a test build here and we'll talk a little bit. I just want to talk for a bit about this actual idea, and then we can talk about maybe ways to expand on this or some other opportunities here. But this is probably the one that most consistently actually makes it into my process. I'm going to just adjust to projections here real quick so we don't see our message, and we'll build. And I'm pretty sure we'll get some White Sox bats. We can use a different team as an example if we want here. But we'll let this build for a second and talk about this here a little bit. I did just want to do a little bit of kind of a summary or a reminder on the point that Devin's talking about in this question here for folks who haven't seen it, because I think this is a good one. And I think this is a really good one for situations like we have tonight, but situations that generally tend to come up a lot. And that's like, how do I deal with a team that's going to be really chalky and I want to play them? And I think it's important to note too that the effect of the ownership fade slider affects the way the lineup is constructed and also affects the way that the lineup ends up being sorted overall. So you can see, actually, it seems like given restrictions on ownership, that the White Sox are probably not our most common stack. It's actually Milwaukee, probably because that they're coming in at a little bit lower ownership, but we are still getting some White Sox bats. And it looks like pretty commonly paired with Milwaukee. That seems to be our favorite lower ownership stack at the moment. Or maybe occasionally a lower owned pitcher, which I'm not so sure if Heaney's going to be lower owned, but we'll see about that. But you can kind of see, right, Cincinnati here. The effects of ownership fade are already going to make it so that you're not playing just a lineup of straight chalk. You're making some sacrifices here or there. But what can we do to add a little bit of additional value here? The way I like to think about this idea is that there's going to be a lot of lineups in your contests that play a lot of White Sox bats. There's going to be a lot of lineups in your contests that play 5 stacks of White Sox bats, and they're in a remarkably good hitting position. And when you play them in a lineup where they are 3 stacked, or we don't have any 2 stacks, but where they are 3 stacked, we have 2 of those lineups, right? The ceiling outcome or the ceiling condition for the 3 bats that you happen to get provide more opportunities for the other bats that are very popular that you do not have, right? So even if you get the ceiling outcome from Moncada, Jimenez, and Sheets, right, and they all have 3 hits apiece and they all do great, they've provided a great deal of additional opportunity in the form of correlation to the other batters in the order. And we're not taking advantage of that, but a lot of other people are. That's the fundamental thinking here, is that we're not maximizing on the ceiling outcome of this particular team. That is a team that a lot of people are otherwise going to stack heavily. And that's kind of the 2 sides of the coin here, right? Is that we're not taking full advantage of the correlation and it's a chalky team. So we are potentially putting ourselves in a position that even if we are right, that it stands to benefit a team that stacked the team more aggressively. That's the whole principle here. So what I like to do in very kind of simple terms is just remove some of these small stacks of these kinds of teams that are really chalky, that I think are going to be often maybe some of the biggest 5 stacks on a slate. I think that is a way to add a little bit of value and it looks like even here, we didn't even end up playing anymore. So we're still getting access to some White Sox stacks, best hitting spot on the night, according to both Vegas and SaberSim, 25% of our lineups. But we're playing for a full-on ceiling outcome, and we're not going to allow ourselves in a situation where that team does have a positive hitting outcome and we end up losing an advantage on the field because of the opportunities that the hitters we stacked provided to the other hitters in the lineup. That's kind of in a nutshell. I think that's a really great point. In terms of like, what are some other things that we can do here? It's kind of a big question, right? There's a lot to talk about here. I think a few other things that maybe are a bit unique that we haven't often had a chance to talk about come into play when thinking about roster constructions in terms of salary, right? So all the players in the pool have a salary associated with them. We have a salary cap that requires us to make decisions, right? That's the game of DFS. And it lends itself to certain constructions that end up being popular that sometimes overweight the likelihood of that, the frequency with which a certain roster construction is played starts to become higher than the actual success of those two individual players being the optimal plays. And I think this is best looked at on the baseball side when looking at pitchers, because there's typically bigger bands of pitcher salaries than there are for hitters. I think it can be a little bit trickier with hitters. I think this is a really good strategy in other sports as well. I think basketball lends itself really well to this, football. But one very easy way to do this is to go back and run what we called our chalk build, right? This is another idea that came up in my original video with Max about finding the right stacks in baseball DFS. And the way we do that is we turn all the sliders off, or actually we can just do that by saying cash. And we set a stack rule, and we'll set a stack rule of like 5. And basically what we're trying to mimic here is we're trying to build lineups that if some random guy just went into typical optimizer and took their projections and said, oh, in baseball DFS, I build a 5 stack and build lineups and print, right? This is like, what's a typical optimizer going to do for the slate tonight if you just put a 5 stack rule in and pressed go? Obviously, we're using SaberSim's projections, which may have some discrepancies, some differences here, but we can get an idea of what different cash viable lineups are. And let's go ahead and see what it looks like. And let's open up our pool a little bit. Let's look at the full 200. And we can kind of get an idea of the different constructions, right? So it seems like actually what is going to be a very common pairing tonight is Wheeler and Bueller together, implying that cheap stacks are gettable, right? First of all, if we're spending $2,000 of our $5,000 salary at pitcher, it means cheap stacks are viable tonight. They are playable, first of all. But it seems like kind of secondarily to that, and I think Heaney and Fried are actually likely to be a little bit more chalky, especially Heaney, than we think tonight. So I actually think probably what is also going to be a very common construction is going to be pairing Wheeler or Bueller with Heaney and Fried, right? So we've identified some pitching constructions. So what does that leave out, right? What are the constructions that are unlikely to be played here? Well, one is a cheaper route at pitcher, right? Where you're playing cheaper pitchers paired together and probably in the interest of getting really expensive bats. The other one would be kind of the mid-range, right? Pitchers that are maybe in the 9K, 8K range paired together. Doesn't seem like it's going to be a very popular construction. And what's interesting about this here is that I think the important thing to note is that we're not so much looking from the stand of the individual upside of these certain players, and we can do that in a second here. We're trying to find lineup builds that are unique because of the places where salary is applied, right? So, for example, if the most common construction was paying 20K at pitcher, and you spent 15K at pitcher or 12K, that's probably a little too low. I don't think that's realistic. But let's say 15K at pitcher and you went with 2 cheaper guys or something like that. And again, this is all slate dependent. I'm not saying that any of this stuff is necessarily viable on the slate tonight, but I'm kind of just providing an example. You are going to get salary access in your hitting stacks that the vast majority of lineups just literally cannot even get. Your constructions themselves will be unique because of the way the salary works. So I think maybe the next step of what you would do here is to then apply this when you actually ran your research build. So let's do that now, since I have time here. We'll talk about what that might look like. So I'm going to drop the stacking rule down to 4. Real quick, Ronald asked, are you guys only using DraftKings as a reference point? It is a bit of a bad habit of mine because DraftKings is my preferred site. I end up typically doing most of my builds here and my my examples and stuff on stream on DraftKings. Whenever somebody says FanDuel, I always am happy to flip over and do FanDuel, and I probably could get better at looking at FanDuel more. So maybe I'll try to work that in here. Right now we're on DraftKings. It's not always DraftKings. I just play a lot of DraftKings, so I end up using it as my reference point a lot. But good question, and I know I can probably improve a little bit there. I'm going to run this as, let's run the full 150. And let's go ahead and run our research build now. So if you're just tuning in or you're a little bit unfamiliar kind of what's going on here. So what we're talking about is we first identified what we thought are going to be the popular constructions around pitcher salary by running a build at cash settings, setting a 5-stack rule, and just seeing what it spits out. And now what we're going to do is we're going to run what we call an upside build, where we turn ownership off, and we turn smart diversity all the way to 10. So we use single game simulations. And what we're trying to do is just get an idea of what is viable, what could potentially be optimal on a slate like this. And let's go ahead and look at this. And I'm going to run the whole 150. So it's going to build 1,500. This is going to take a second, but I want to have a nice big pool to look at. And I'll talk about maybe how you can kind of apply this, because just because a certain pitcher salary construction is possible doesn't always mean that there's a lot of other ways to go in your builds, right? It could be that there's 4 pitchers and some random combination of any 2 of them, like on tonight's slate. I think Fried, Heaney, Bueller, Wheeler, right? I think combinations of any 2 of those guys are going to be pretty popular. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's always viable builds that don't include at least one. Or that there's a lot of viable builds, or that you can eliminate them and still have enough builds to work with outside of that. So now we can take this into our research build and kind of identify, are there other opportunities, right? Or are there opportunities to do something different with our salary at pitcher that is naturally going to force us into different kinds of constructions, right? So this will just take a second. Again, I want the full pool of 1,500 here. To work with, because I want to make sure I have a lot of lineups. So, but this is a great question. I was excited to have a little bit of a chance to talk about this, because I've been thinking about these concepts a little bit lately, where it's not so much, we're not really researching baseball right now, right? This isn't updating projections because we think that a guy's dealing with an injury, or because Vegas lines have moved, right? Or something like that. This is really like a very DFS-y theory kind of thing that is interesting to talk about, but is somewhat removed from the sport itself here, and really focused on kind of the limitations of the game itself that we're playing. So let's expand our pool up to, actually, you know what? Let's keep it at 500, because I want to have the opportunity to actually be able to edit my exposure. So I'm not going to fill to the full 1,500. We're going to leave it at 500. And I think what is an interesting way to do this is to just kind of start looking at what sacrifices you make when you opt out of certain constructions. So we saw that Wheeler and Bueller are probably the 2 kind of most common pitchers that are going to be used. There's going to be a lot of lineups that use both. There's going to be a ton of lineups that use one or the other. I'm curious. I'm just like, let's test the builder out and see how viable it thinks it is to play neither. Right? So what sacrifices are we making? Our best lineup has dropped to 32, Saber score of 94. If we were playing a full pool of 150, we are a little bit outside the top third of total lineups, right? So we built 1,500 lineups based on optimals that are coming out in the slate tonight. And we're seeing that there's a lot of ways to go. There's a lot of ways to be. There's a lot of optimal looking lineups that don't include either of those 2 pitchers. And it might be that the win equity of that particular construction here is overweighted by the field, right? And we can look at what some of these lineups start to look like. So here's an interesting one where we play 2 value guys. Fried's going to be pretty chalky, but we play kind of a more value pitcher that's probably a little less chalky. And if you look at these salaries, like look what we're able to spend at hitting. We've got 5,800 Javier Baez in a win game. Are they playing in I think they're playing in Wrigley, right? Win game in Wrigley. These are not just individual players that maybe the field is underweighting, and maybe they're even chalky, but it's combinations of players that are unlikely to get played because of the way we are playing. We're using a different construction overall. We're using a salary construction overall that it allows us to get combinations of bats that are difficult to come by. I'm looking to see if there's another one. Here's another one that's interesting. Like another thing that would be another way of looking at this, right? Is that we play the chalky construction, but we're subbing in a player that is probably just going to be extremely lowly owned because at his salary band, all of the exposure is going to go to Bueller and Wheeler. Here's another one. Look at these prices on these bats, right? We're playing $6,700 Patrick Corbin that the field, no matter what, and he's not in the best spot probably, right? His value is pretty low. He's projected for 11 points, but he shows up in optimal lineups. And we've got this lineup where who's going to be able to build this lineup playing the chalk construction? Nobody, right? These are chalky players. Contreras is chalky. Abreu's chalky. Whoops. Moncada's chalky. Tim Anderson's chalky. But who's going to be able to play all those guys together? No one, unless there's a certain sacrifice made at pitching salary that no one else is going to do. And that's kind of the point that I'm getting at here, is that this is beyond looking at the players' ranges of outcomes and odds of having a ceiling outcome or odds of showing up in the optimal lineup versus their ownership, which is kind of what we get at when we typically run this build. A lot of what we always kind of harp on as a way to do this is to set this as the full 1,500 and look at who's optimal, right? Compare that maybe to their ownership, right? Seeing if maybe the field is overweighting or underweighting a certain player, someone like Bumgarner, right? Shows up in 2 times as many optimal lineups as his projected ownership, or in team stacks, looking at this compared to Vegas odds or something like that, or ownership projections to see if there's a team like Colorado that's showing up much higher. That's the typical way we do this, but this is kind of an alternate way of thinking about it from a roster construction around your salary of, are there constructions, not teams or players or stacks, but are there constructions that the field is underweighting compared to their relative success? And we eliminated the 2 by far chalkiest pitchers on the slate that are likely to be either paired together often or used one or the other extremely often, and found that even just in the pool of the first 1,500 optimals, we don't even have to leave the top third of that. We're like, our best lineup is still in the top third of the top 1,500 optimals here by eliminating construction that's going to be overwhelmingly used. And this actually, now that I'm looking at it, is a slate that this conversation works really well for. This doesn't always work. I've actually tried to do this on a slate before where we had a similar deal. And we literally, we were literally it was almost impossible to remove both the 2 pitchers at the top. And it also doesn't have to be, the last thing I'll kind of note here is that it doesn't necessarily have to be that it's the 2 aces that you're eliminating, right? This is entirely slate dependent. So it just so happens that after we ran our chalk build that we discovered that this lineup construction is going to be fairly popular. But there are slates where 2 cheaper pitchers is the chalk construction, or studs and scrubs where you play an ace and some guy at like min price because he's in a perceived really good matchup or something like that. Or it's all about identifying what that construction is and look at ways to be different from it. And I think kind of the ways that we would be different tonight, or the way that we could potentially force being different, is by doing that. And also, I'm using this for the purpose of an example of where I completely faded Bueller and Wheeler in a test build just to see if that was viable. This does not necessarily mean that you need to take that level of an aggressive stand where you're going into your actual build you're running and you're just Xing out the two highest projected pitchers on the slate. Maybe it is, right? I think what the test build has shown us is that maybe that's actually viable, especially in a really top heavy contest or something like that. But that doesn't mean that's what you must do. Maybe you are setting an exposure limit on them. So maybe you're matching the field or something like that. Or I don't know. Maybe if you're only playing a couple lineups one thing you could do is just make sure that you're not playing them both together. So even if you're playing up to 20 or something like that, right? It's very easy to let's just say this was our actual build and we were playing 20 lineups, right? This is a little bit of what's the word? Manual work. But maybe we're filtering by Wheeler and Bueller, and there's only 2 lineups, and we can eliminate those 2. And let's fill back up. And now do we have any? No. So that could be a way of doing it, right? And maybe that's, so now we're almost at this point, like maybe this is a way to be different enough. But this doesn't get you as different of roster constructions, having Wheeler in 100% of your lineups, because you're actually just going to end up playing really common constructions. So maybe it doesn't work as well unless you're willing to take a really aggressive stand. But I think that's probably like the most interesting other one that has kind of come into mind here as I've been hosting the show and talking through this stuff that we really haven't had a chance to really dive into yet. There's a couple other ideas that we've talked about here before. I think while I have the time, let me see. I don't see any other questions. There is one other in the queue that I will get to, but I'll keep talking about this since I have the time. If anyone has any questions, feel free to shout them out. I'll jump right over since I'm kind of going off on my own here a little bit. I think the last point or the last thing that maybe I haven't really talked about often here before is let's go back to our test build here and take a look at this. And some of this is stealing a little bit of thunder from what I'll talk about in my video tonight when I'm actually building these lineups for my contest, because this is one I definitely like to use. But let's go ahead and back and look here. When you are looking at your stands on a slate, your approaches overall, especially on contests that are top heavy, that are bigger, that we need extra leverage, we can find that, I think. Why is it saying that? It shouldn't be saying that. We can find that sometimes by kind of thinking about, okay, there we go. By thinking about what happens at the ceiling outcomes for certain players, right? So a good example of that is if you are going to be overweight on an unpopular player or underweight on a popular player, it may make sense to think about what the game outcomes look like when you are right about that, or when that player, I don't know why I keep saying this message, it's annoying me, has success. Sorry, I keep getting distracted here. And then build that into your exposures overall. And this really works well if you're playing like at least 20 lineups, but maybe even 150. I don't even know why is it even going to build more lineups here? I don't know why that message was showing up. We'll just let this catch its breath here for a second. It might be because I was messing with exposures and then re-expanded the pool. That's actually probably what it is, now that I think about it. I think I had an exposure in there and re-expanded the pool, and it was like, whoa, 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 don't do that. So we'll just give this a second to catch up. Oh, it's still going. I think it's only going to build another 150. I'll just let this finish because I don't want to see that message. I want to look at this, and we'll go from there. Okay, I'm just going to stop it. Hopefully, leave me alone. Okay, perfect. Okay, so one of them that popped off like immediately to me when I was just looking at this, mostly because I've already researched the slate a little bit here today, is the Heaney situation overall, right? I think he's likely to be much chalkier than this. And I noticed it first because Colorado is popping as a stack when we look at our full pool. And when we look at something like the Vegas odds for the slate tonight, that is just not the same situation, right? So we've clearly got this situation here where Colorado is likely to be not very highly owned. I think Heaney's likely to be very owned. The field perceives that that's a good pitching matchup for Heaney or a bad hitting spot for Colorado, right? And we can go and check here and look back at Colorado, right? We are a run over their run total right now. There's kind of some general indications that we are overweight on Colorado. And maybe this is a situation that necessitates more research, right? Sometimes maybe the answer is to bring down this run total if you think that there's something that's being overlooked, but maybe we're happy with this and we want to roll with it, right? It may make more sense rather than playing both sides of this here in 150 lineups of having some exposure to Heaney and to Colorado to kind of play a side there, right? And play the situation where we're right. Like I keep hearing, I've been watching a lot of best ball content lately for NFL, and there's this interesting saying that's kind of been floating around where people are saying draft like you're right. And I think some of that's a little bit can be applied here too, especially again, single entry, 3 max, small field stuff. Maybe this doesn't fit. This is like for bigger contests where you really need to be very right to be profitable over the long term, right? There's this idea of, I think, kind of think like build your lineups like you're right. And this almost to me, if you can't tell already, I feel a little less confident about this idea overall than the one we were just talking about. But there's this idea to me that like this almost feels like a 10% hedge against a outlook that we have about the slate overall. If Heaney's actually going to be 30% owned, which I think he could be, and our model is a run total over on Vegas on the Rockies, and they are our 6th most popular stack of a team that has a Vegas total of 4.0 runs or something like that. Build your lineups like you're right, because you need to be so right to be profitable in the kind of contest I'm imagining this strategy being useful for. Even like something like the Minimax, 45,000 entrants, right? You need to be very right to win that. And if I only have 150 lineups to play with, maybe I'm not so interested in using 15 of them as a hedge against the other 15 of them that have Colorado bats, right? So the way I would maybe apply this is to just fully fade Heaney, because he's the chalky piece in this. You could kind of do a similar approach. Let's see if, let me see here. I want to find one that's not so black and white. I feel like hitter and pitcher like that are very, very black and white. But let me see if I can find one. I guess it is just going to be that way, but I want to find one that's maybe not so like in your face, because we're a run total over Colorado, and that may change or that may come down, but maybe one that's not so aggressive. And I think a good example is I saw that Tyler Mahle was showing up in a lot of optimals here as well. And I think that might be an interesting one. Because we're also, I think the thing that would be interesting with Mahle here, wow, we have 3,000. I don't really know why. Holy smokes. I don't know why this built so many lineups for us now. Maybe I'll start with a new build. That's crazy. Why are there 3,000 lineups? Anyway, hang on. Be patient with me here. I may need to just start with a new build because this is okay. So this was popping that was just like somewhat interesting to me, of like another guy that I think Chicago's going to be popular, right? 5.0 run total. I don't think Mahle's going to be very popular. We have him as the 6th most optimal pitcher of 1,500 lineups. And we like Chicago too. They're our 2nd most popular stack. But there's almost, I feel like between those two weights, right, of playing Chicago and being right with a lot of other people that are also playing Chicago versus playing Mahle, who has perceived optimal equity that I don't think will come in this high owned, to be completely honest. If Chicago comes in as high as I think they're going to be, maybe the better route here is to be overweight on Mahle. And the reason why I think this is like a strategy, or like this is actually something that you could do, or a way you could add additional value, is because the top 20 lineups I don't think are actually going to really represent this. So you can see here, when we limit it down to actually just 20, we're just getting Chicago because they're the lineups that show up at the top. But we were just given a reason by the builder that maybe there's a case to be made for playing the other side of that, where we can find additional leverage on the field. So let me know if that is confusing, if anyone's just like totally lost. on that one. It's I don't know. I think the idea there is like looking at a situation where maybe there's SaberSim is giving you an indication that there's optimal equity or win equity on both sides of the coin, of the pitcher and the stack. And if that's the case, it may sometimes make just sense to just pick the one that zig where the field's going to zag, right? Like the one that the field's not going to do. And we saw that, yeah, sure, Maile is the sixth best pitcher. And Chicago is the second best stack, according to the lineups that we've built at these optimal settings. But that's not how they're being perceived. Or actually that's not how they're being perceived. Maile's probably being perceived as like one of the worst pitchers, and the stack is being perceived as one of the better stacks. So anyway, that's kind of like the idea there. I think those are two, before I keep going on and using up my whole time I have here today, right? In summary, one is looking at roster construction by salary and knowing that if a certain amount of salary is committed to pitchers, certain amounts of salary cannot be committed to hitters because of the salary requirements. And we can use that as a tool to build unique constructions without even looking at the players necessarily, right? We know that we have constructions that are unique because of the way we applied our salary. And number two is that, especially in top heavy contests where you're playing a lot of entries, look at when there are optimal constructions that use kind of both sides of a coin of players that are negatively correlated with one another. Consider taking a player at maybe a slightly less chance of being optimal, or taking the side that has a slightly less chance of being optimal if you're expecting the field to way overly gravitate to the team that's perceived as being optimal, right? So we had two examples. Heaney and Colorado both have Colorado stacks have equal optimal equity. They were both showing up in 10% of our big pool of 1,500 lineups, but the field's going to play Heaney. So consider Colorado. Same thing with Maile and the Cubs, right? Maile is our sixth most popular pitcher, or sixth most optimal pitcher, looking at the full pool. Here, I should just pull this back up. And Chicago is our second most popular stack when looking at the full pool. But the field's not going to play Maile. They're going to play Chicago. So consider Maile, right? So interesting ideas. I think those are kind of, that's kind of the way I thought about this question, right? Of like the dial-in process to make our lineups different than the field. And this isn't so much, this is like game theory kind of stuff. This isn't so much, you don't need to be digging into advanced stats or MLB stat sites or anything like that, right? This is like pure thinking about literally the game theory, like the components that make up the game in terms of salary requirements that we can take advantage of. So anyway, been harping on this here for 38 minutes. I hope that was helpful. I had fun talking about it at the very least. I do have one other question in my queue, and I will jump into that here now in a moment. Hang on one sec. Okay, cool. So this question came in from Adam here, and I think maybe this is maybe just looking for a little bit more of resources here, but we'll talk about this for a bit. So he said, hey, Jordan, not necessarily a question for office hours, but could you point me to some past videos where you may have reviewed the golf model, slider use, lineup building, etc.? Or if not, maybe this could be discussed in office hours at some point in the future. Thanks again. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll first start by pointing you to some resources here, because we do have them, and they're going to be able to go in more depth than I can here on the show. So let me go ahead and pull up the SaberSim YouTube page here again, and I'll show you where to find these. So, okay, share screen. Okay, so this is our YouTube channel. I've had this up a couple times throughout the week. I think this is useful. The first session I will show you. So all of our strategy sessions are here under this playlist, strategy sessions, right on the homepage. Max and I did this video, and it's titled How to Beat PGA DFS for the US Open and Other Majors. It does not have to be thought of as like a major specific video, right? We talk a little bit about maybe some nuance that takes place when you're talking about a major, but this is really just a great video for like a full-on introduction to beating golf DFS. I think the big themes that we talked about in there overall are the importance of trimming your player pool and cutting off players that have huge downsides with limited upside, to be very intentional and focused on thinking about ownership overall. One of the highest value things I think you can do to SaberSim when you're playing golf DFS is adjust our ownership projections, primarily because ownership is basically the main way that we find an edge in golf DFS. There's no correlation. Not really. There's sometimes tee time correlation, but it's a weak factor overall. Leverage on the field in terms of ownership is I think, the biggest factor that we can find in golf DFS. And ownership in golf is also very heavily narrative driven, because I think it's hard for people to find an edge out there. I think what the field and the industry gravitates towards in golf DFS is narratives and like very maybe minor edges, like things like this is his home field, or he grew up around here, or he lives around here, or various things, sometimes a very short-sighted look at course history, like things that probably have some very minor factors associated with them in terms of predicting future output, but get way overloaded by the field, right? So researching what the field is likely to do. I guess final note on that. The reason why I think it's a high value add to SaberSim is that at the moment, we've talked about ways to be creative about this, but at the moment, our ownership projections don't really pick up any narratives or like industry buzz. So if a player is just getting touted a ton, like Hank Lebioda, I think last week in the 3M Open, we didn't have him projected for a very high ownership, but the field ended up taking it like 30% because there was just this positive feedback loop of like one guy touts him and one guy touts him and one guy touts him, and no one wants to get left holding the bag. So everybody touts him. He ends up 30% owned. Something like that, right? I think you can add a lot of value by adjusting ownership projections for golf. And then the third and kind of final point that we really talk about there in this video is contest selection. And again, with golf being sometimes a sport where the edge is a little thinner, a little harder to find, just be careful. Play a bankroll investment that you can really weather pretty extreme swings. I think you can have pretty extreme swings in golf DFS. And I think it's a sport that really lends itself well to single entry and free max as opposed to 150 maxes. I still play a lot of 150 maxes for golf DFS, but I do think it lends itself better to smaller field, smaller entry limit kind of contests because of the nature of the game. So that was a quick summary. Again, this is an hour and 10 seconds long, much more in depth. Some of this includes us actually going through and doing this live for the past US Open this season. So that's a good video. And then before I move on, there are this video too, from closer to the start of this golf season. I think it is just Andy, Max, and Danny on this one. 20 minutes. This is a little bit quicker. 7 Secrets of Daily Fantasy Golf. This is a really good video as well, especially talking about in actual other external resources that you can use to add value to SaberSim. Some of the free resources on Data Golf and on the PGA Tour website. Some weather resources in there too. So those are the 2 videos I would start with. That's hour and a half or so of awesome golf content. And then from there, if you have questions for me, come back to office hours and shout them out. Let me know. And I'm happy to kind of talk about any specific golf questions that you have from there or anything like that. I love golf DFS, but it is hard. It's probably one of my like lower performing sports overall. I think it's a blast to play, but it's a hard one for sure. So give those videos a watch and go from there. So question from Ronald here. Does SaberSim only show individual stack ownership, or do they do team projected ownership as well? Unfortunately, at the moment, it is just individual ownership of batters. I know there are some sites out there that are doing stack ownership. It is just kind of tricky when you can stack a team 2 ways, 3 ways, 4 ways, 5 ways, all these different combinations of players. I think if you're trying to get an idea of what stacks are likely to be popular, I think you can get an idea by just going to the batters tab, clicking my own, and just looking at the teams you're seeing here, right? This, I think, in general is a pretty good approach. Chicago, LA, Dodgers, Cincinnati, Atlanta, right? Very quick gut check. Then you can compare to like what Vegas has. So for the main slate tonight, Chicago, or I guess I should say White Sox, Angels. This is one that we're not projecting very high ownership. Might be because of weather. There's a bit of a weather concern there. Cincinnati, Brewers, Chicago, right? I think this is a spot you can add some value here. Again, just because if there's a discrepancy in the way we are projecting a team overall, or if there's industry buzz or a narrative about a certain team, we may not pick up on it. I think we do a very good job of identifying which plays are likely to be the chalkiest in like an ordinal ranking. But I have seen myself and also heard from people before that at times we don't always project the top owned plays at the actual value that they end up being owned. So one spot that I think you can add some value is if you have a sense of what teams are likely to be chalky, or even relying on our ownership projections as a starting point to do some gentle kind of bumping up of ownership projections from there, right? I think it's very possible that a guy like Tim Anderson is actually 30% owned tonight. And maybe Moncada is 25 and things like this. And you can kind of identify some of the chalkier teams and bump up their ownership projections. I think this is a big value add, something that I will be doing in my video tonight, at least a little bit when I'm building my individual lineups here live and talking through this. So yeah, I think that's a good one. But I would also just be wary. Like, I mean, you can find stack ownership projections out there. Just do your research and look into those and see if you can find out what that is actually attempting to tell you. Typically, it is a very basic calculation of something like the average ownership of the top 5 projected and most owned players in the lineup. So someone might say that Chicago's 5-stack ownership is the average of these 5 players, which isn't really a mathematically sound calculation to do that. Sometimes you can also see people use ownership products where they multiply each individual's player's ownership and give you an ownership projection for the team. And that ends up, or for that particular stack, but that ends up not always working very well because it doesn't really it kind of treats every player as an individual event, and they're not, and the field knows that they're correlated. So those kinds of projections, I think, end up being artificially low. So I think it's something that we've talked about implementing in the future, but we want to do it the right way, in a way that the calculation makes sense and is accurate, rather than doing it the fast way. And I think that's a lot of what you'll find out there is faster than it is more accurate or calculated more appropriately. So just be careful. I think in general, like honestly, my biggest way of assessing what stacks are going to be the most popular is literally looking at Vegas and looking at the totals, and like then using your own sense of intuition, right? Like, I think if the weather's still bad, Baltimore's probably going to come a little bit lower. But here's your chalk. It's the White Sox. It's the Angels. It's the Reds, Brewers, Cubs. Probably that. Then you get to some of these teams that I think are going to be a little bit maybe less chalky overall. But that's it. There's your chalk, right? And if you want to go in and you make sure that those teams are accordingly adjusted here in the ownership projections, then do it. I think you can use like typically I'll use either like a 2x or a 1.5 multiplier to just quickly do this. So like I think the Angels are going to be way chalkier than this. This is a really good example. So if I use like a 2x multiplier, maybe even more in this particular case, but you can really quickly just go through. I'm just like kind of quick, roughly multiplying these by 2 in my head, and getting a little bit closer. And it might even be more than this, but I think this is a good starting point. And you can do this because when we actually look at ownership fade and we're fading certain players at specific ownership values, like I think the immediate question is, well, okay, then don't I have to take the ownership away from somewhere else? Short answer to that is I wouldn't really worry about that. The way ownership fade actually works is it's normalized to the average of the position. So even though like these players are now not going to be like technically Shohei, or actually, let's do this. Technically, Fletcher can't be 14% owned if all of these other second base projections, ownership projections, are true, because it will be too much second base ownership. I wouldn't worry about that because again, everything kind of gets normalized to the average for the position. So it won't do anything disruptive to your lineup builds to just do quick and dirty ownership projection updates like this. So cool. Yeah, Ronald said, I'm going to try SaberSim out. Thanks for the info. Yeah, we have a free 7-day trial right here on the site, SaberSim.com. And start my free trial. It'll take you to the sign up page. It's going to redirect me because I'm already logged in, but free 7 days. So definitely check it out. No strings attached. If you don't like it, hopefully you do. But if you don't like it, come back to office hours. Tell me why you don't like it, and maybe I'll see if I can help you. But no strings attached if it's not for you. So worth it for everybody to at least give us a try here. I think we're doing something pretty unique and pretty different. Talked a little bit at the end of the show yesterday about some of the things that really make us different here. So, but thank you for tuning in today. Glad to have you. All right, 51 minutes in or so today. I think I've covered pretty much everything. Pretty interesting show today. Just a couple questions, but had an opportunity to kind of dig in deep to these. So we talked about first, some ways to add additional value to our lineups that are very roster construction, very game theory focused, not so much on the researching baseball, advanced stats kinds of things, right? Thinking about the salary limitations of the way our rosters are constructed, the leverage of playing one side or the other on a game or a game where the builder thinks both sides are optimal, right? We talked a little bit about golf strategy, a quick summary of some of the other golf content we have out there. So it was interesting. And then a little bit of ownership discussion, team stack ownership, assessing ownership, making adjustments, that kind of thing. So it's been a fun show. Again, reminder that I'm going to be recording here about an hour before lock tonight, my live baseball process for how I'm going to build my actual individual lineups for tonight's slate with Andy on, asking me questions as I go along. And I'm going to be entering those lineups. So it will be a live look into all the strategies we've been talking about this season, but me actually applying them and showing you how I'm doing it, how I apply it on a slate like tonight. So we will be publishing that video tomorrow. Enjoy watching that. And then I think if there are any follow-up questions after watching that video, I think those will be great for office hours probably on Friday. So we can talk a little bit more about it tomorrow, but maybe I'm doing something that you don't really understand or doesn't make sense or you find surprising at a certain point in the video for my lineups. You can grill me on it on Friday and ask why I did certain thing. So I'm sure inevitably all 150 lineups that I build will probably end up failing to even cash tonight because that's the way it works. And I'm going to go on and expose myself here and do a video where I'm actually building the lineup. So naturally, I think they are all probably destined to fail. But what would be even cooler is if maybe I took a contest down or banked one of those or something like that, and then could have this video together of walking through how I put those lineups together. But either way, a lot of variance in baseball DFS. Whatever happens tonight, it is what I will be demonstrating is the actual strategies that I use to build my lineups every night. So should be a lot of fun. Anyway, won't take up any more of your guys' time today here. Thank you again for everybody that tuned in. As always, if you have questions when you're working on your lineups tonight or at any other time, feel free to email us, support@sabersim.com. Let us know, and I will tackle them on the next office hours show. And if you... Or I guess Office Hours channel on Slack is the other place you can go ahead and ask those questions until our next show. So enjoy the slate tonight. Have fun. And I will see you guys all tomorrow. See ya.